Hi, everyone. Today we have a virtual seminar. So, good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are. A few logistics before I introduce the speaker. For those of you who are virtually there, please mute yourself during the talk. Also, we'll take questions at the end of the talk, not during the talk. For those in the room, please use the mic in front when you want to ask questions. All right. Today we have a special guest, Dr. John Eicher, an associate professor of history at Penn State Altoona. He's a special kind of historian. His research and teaching focuses on the movements of people and diseases around the world. It's very relevant in public health, specifically in infectious disease epidemiology. His first book, entitled Exiled Among Nations, German and Mennonite Mythologies in a Translational Age, has been very well recognized. His second book, which I think is not published yet, entitled The Sword Outside the Plague Within, the 1918 influenza pandemic in Europe, is what he will be talking about today. As we all know, specifically in public health, in 1918, a strain of H1N1 virus spread across the globe, assisted by humans' movements in World War I. Millions, I mean millions, died during that time. We learned a lot about quarantine, vaccine, isolation from this pandemic and applied several of those concepts during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eicher to our AP seminar, and we are very eager to learn about the historical perspective of the Spanish flu. Dr. Eicher, welcome.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and I'm very glad to be speaking with all of you here today. My name's John Eicher at Penn State University, and the title of my lecture today is Memories and Maps, the Epidemiology of 1918 Flu Survivors' Experiences. So I was asked to give a little background of myself and my trajectory towards my academic career. So I'll quick go over that. It might be a little unfamiliar. I'm definitely in the humanities, a history professor, so maybe a little different trajectory than what you're familiar with, but I'll run through it. So I was born in Bern, Indiana. It's a small Mennonite community. They're related to the Amish, sort of simple living, peace, nonviolence community, and so forth. And it's just north of another little town called Geneva. So there's a whole Swiss region there. But that's where I grew up, and that is what really informed the intellectual and academic trajectory, actually, that I would take. After that, I went to a small school, small liberal arts school called Goshen College. And for a year in between my sophomore and junior year, I left college and volunteered at a homeless shelter in Seattle for a year that just sort of expand my horizons beyond these small environments that I'd been in. After that, I did another year of voluntary work in Germany to learn German. I knew I wanted to go to grad school, and I knew I wanted to do German, maybe Mennonite history, and I knew I needed to learn the language. So I volunteered for a year in Germany, and then I chose to go to the University of Iowa for my master's and PhD. And while I was there, I got heavily involved in a project that then became my first book, and about German and Mennonite immigration. And that landed me with a postdoc at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. And then the year after that, I began my work here at Penn State. So my first book, as Sandeep briefly mentioned there, Exiled Among Nations, it has nothing to do with health history, or anything like that. I'll tell you how I got to that in a minute. But it basically follows two groups of German-speaking Mennonites who migrated across 4 continents between 1870 and 1945. One group was composed of refugees, the other was voluntary. And I look at how both groups used their reasons for moving, whether forced or voluntary, and then how they sold themselves to the governments that they would come to live under. either as, we're good Germans, or, we're productive farmers, or we're Christians, or we're not only Christians, but we're not Catholic, we're Mennonite. And so they negotiate their way around the world, sort of adding and removing identifications. And at the same time, governments and religious NGOs are looking at them. They're creating their own stories about these people. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, and then they keep moving. So the whole book is about how groups of people create narratives about themselves in their groups, and how those narratives, whether at the national or religious or communal level, change over time. And this project got me interested in transnational history, looking at places around the world, and then seeing how they connect. So, and then comparing them, comparative history. I'm also interested on how cultures interpret phenomena, wars, diseases, and so forth, and also an interest on collective narratives. How do groups of people come up with and then remember stories about these big events that they're involved in? So that brings us up to the present. And that brings us up to the research on my current book project, which is The Sword Outside, The Plague Within, and it involves understanding the cultural dimensions of the 1918 flu in Europe. So in 2018, I went to Berlin, Germany, thinking very much that I was going to do my next book on German immigrants to Texas in the 1840s. You have war, you have immigration, you have different cultures and so forth. I get to Germany, I get to the relevant archives, I'm in the archives, and I discover all the information I need is written in German script, handwriting, Old German. And that's just basically a different language than typed German that I'm familiar to reading. So I was kind of demoralized, went back to the apartment, talking to my wife. She had seen some advertisement. We don't even really play video games, but she had seen an advertisement for this strange new game. I think it's called Outbreak, or I don't know, Contagion or something. But you're supposed to kill the whole world with a disease that you invent. And it was also 2018, and I was thinking 1918. So I went back to the archive, got what I could from it on the 1918 archive, and it was actually a lot. And no one had looked at it. Like 5 people had looked at it in like 15 years. So I thought, this is my project. The next year, I went to London to another archive, and there I discovered what is known as the Collier collection. And it has nearly 1,000 flu survivors' handwritten memories and letters and interviews from the 1970s. And it's an amazing collection. And apparently Collier had a big book advance. The way he got all these things was to hire research assistants, send them out to different countries, run advertisements in local newspapers, and then interview willing participants. The unfortunate thing is then he sort of like grabbed the most interesting stories and put them together and then called it a book. And he doesn't have any interpretation or meaning behind it. It's just like, look at these cool stories. And so other historians have used letter sets or, individual letters. I wanted to take the whole thing and look at it as an aggregate. So a pro is that it's very diverse. It's very unbiased. It's basically the only bias is towards maybe extroverts who read newspapers. A con, of course, collected half a century after 1918, so memories might be fuzzy. And there's also no standardized questions or information. I had to, through my own research, figure out what the common themes are. A couple years later then, or that next year, I followed that up with a year-long fellowship in Freiburg, Germany. And I did archival research in France, Germany, and Switzerland, sort of this nexus, this nodal point in the center of Western Europe to sort of round out those sources. The methodology then that I used to organize all of this, to get that information out of it, involved using a database in the humanities, the history. I don't really do databases, so this is a very simple database. It's called Tropy, and I'll do a visual demo in a minute. But working with a team of student researchers in Freiburg and then here at Penn State, uh, I had the team read all of the letters and then pull out data tags from those letters, like, subject age, symptoms, healthcare provider, location, so forth. Gave the students really good experiential learning, and then it let me use that quantitative research for qualitative interpretation. I also created a Google map of all of the survivors, so I could see where they are, in a dimensional space. I could see where they're clustered. In fact, lots actually were moving at the time. They're nearly all young people between about 16 and 30 years old. That's what most of the memories are from. And these people they're fighting in wars, they're nurses, they're working. And so there's actually quite a bit of movement while they have the flu. And then also try and pick up on urban and rural differences between the different individuals. So I'm just going to briefly show you a visual demonstration of this methodology here. This is my database, and there you can see my list of different letters and then other archives I went to. One of my tags was emotion, and so here we'll look at happiness. 3 individuals, weirdly, all from the UK, expressed some form of happiness, pity. I have a lot of yeah, you can see on the right-hand side there all the different tags. And then these are linked directly to an actual copy of the picture. So I can then go directly to the picture, read it, and then get context around those different tags to drill in if I need a quote or something like that. There again, on the left-hand side, healthcare remedy, healthcare treatment, government response, all the different tags there. And doing this produced a tremendous number of tags that I then had to go back and, bring into line. But you can just see there the vast number of impressions that people included in these flu letters. And each letter was about 1 to 6, maybe 7 pages long. Okay, go on here to the map. We can see here, if it plays, there you go. All of the different, why is it not playing? I'll just jump ahead here. I don't know why it keeps pausing, but ultimately, yeah, I can go and zoom in on particular locations, see all the individuals in that location, and then, oh, it's replaying it again. Okay, well, now we can see it. But I also have a chart that comes up, and with that chart, there we go, I can see the population numbers in each of those locations and really give me that, fine-tooth comb impression of the kind of context these people lived in. All right. So now I'll get into the research proper. First of all, quick background, right? What was the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic? Well, Spanish, given that name, owing to wartime censorship, Spain was one of the first countries, in addition to other neutral countries in Europe, but one of the first to report on this disease, particularly because King Alfonso, the King of Spain, got it. He recovered, but that was something of a news story throughout Europe, though, as we'll see in a little bit, not the kind of news story that everyone was, immediately aware of. It had uncertain beginnings, likely a bird estuary near Fort Riley, Kansas, perhaps France, China too. Recently, there's been some interest in possible China origin, and then brought with troops from across the United States and to Europe that way. There are 3 major waves affecting North America and Europe. The first was a very mild wave. March and July went almost unnoticed in some places or dismissed in others. A very haphazard news story as it's coming out. The main wave is from September to December 1918, and that is where I focus my research. It was the biggest wave. It was the most severe. It's also happening directly over the same time as the end of the war and the armistice, which World War I, and the armistice, which takes place in November 11th, 1918. And then there's a third more mild wave in January to April, because the second wave had killed most everyone who was going to die of it. This happening at a time when the global population was nearly 2 billion, could have been upwards of 500 million or so infections. Global deaths on this, and as we'll see in a little bit, the numbers will forever remain sketchy. Initially 20 million, then 30, 40. Now it's anywhere between 50 to 100 million in the world. And combined with pneumonia, because pneumonia often accompanied these flu infections, it targeted young, healthy individuals. And that's what makes it so mind-blowing, I think, is that the vast majority of the deaths came in people at the peak of life, the shoulders of society holding everything up, between 15 and 35. And it killed them by provoking cytokine, might have pronounced that wrong, cytokine storm, wherein your healthy, where your white blood cells just decide to rampage and attack everything, virus and your own body's immune system all together, just in an attempt to destroy it. And your immune system actually ends up killing you as a result. So 6 themes that I look at in my research and writing. First of all, I'm interested, right, where they lived, the cultural geography of the pandemic, comparing how different locations in different countries are seeing this and interpreting it. Where they lived, or I'm sorry, when they lived. The time period is essential to understand the 1918 flu. Obviously, the First World War, the end of the war, the chaos after the war. You have revolution. You already have revolution in, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, but then you have revolutionary activity and revolutions in the Austro-Hungarian Empire that fell apart, the German Empire falling apart, even in neutral countries like Switzerland and Spain and the Netherlands. You have strikes. People are upset about inflation and food, revolutionary rumors. So a very politically and socially intense and fraught time. How they interpreted it, and as we'll see, particularly in today's lecture, they see the war and the flu as being combined in their heads. They are combined, and it is a war plague for a lot of people, especially in belligerent countries. Who was responsible? Authority and blame during the pandemic, looking at who people thought should be fixing this or how it came. Very interesting results there. Not a lot of blame for government, though a lot of suspicion that the flu is being spread by dead bodies on the war front, and it isn't flu, right? It could be plague. So a combination there with the war in terms of how it's spreading. It's miasma theory, which I'll get to in a little bit. And then how they responded. The medicines they use, the treatments, the remedies, and this all, look on the eve of medical science's golden age, as they discover viruses and then antibiotics and so forth. And then finally, what they felt, the physical and emotional toll of the pandemic. How are people interpreting this, and what kind of feelings are they attaching to this sudden new form of death in their midst? Oh, sorry. And then finally, why was the 1918 flu forgotten? This perennial question, why was it forgotten? Okay, and finally, my thesis, what I'm arguing here in this lecture, if you could boil it down to one thing, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic was a Spanish influenza pandemic for some contemporary elites. elite sort of doctors, scientists, particularly in the UK with sort of a broader global reach, and also future historians looking back. But in real time, it was a local food insecurity plague. And that's how people understood it as it was unfolding. And that is the argument to which I now turn. A world war, but not a global pandemic. I don't think the authorities did much. There was not so many newspapers. I believe that southern Sweden was very badly hit. So it's just sort of a regional knowledge of this disease there. So a world war, but not a global pandemic. Just a little background on the historical profession. In the 1990s, there was a strong interest in what's called the transnational turn, trying to figure out how Europeans imagine the broader world and engage the broader world from their continental position. So via migration and also imperial activity, there's the sense that Europeans are now connected to the globe. And while Europeans understood World War I as a world war, owing to massive press coverage and talking about colonies, troop transports, and so forth, it lasted for 4 years, Europeans were very aware of the war's global dimensions. Yet, Europeans did not conceptualize the 1918 flu as a global pandemic. And this sort of flies in the face of our assumption that Europeans kind of know about the world by 1918. Well, the reason why this wasn't the case is, I mean, there's just massive shortages across the entire European continent. Even paper is being rationed. Papers are now like 2 or 3 pages long, being printed maybe only 2 or 3 times a week. Fuel shortages. How do you distribute newspapers when there's fuel shortages, when there's manpower shortages? And then during the pandemic, half the press staff is down. So how do you even relay news, in the moment? Add to that censorship. Governments tried to block anything that could reduce morale or injure the idea they still believed they were being competent by this late in the war. Secondly, the flu hits very fast, rapid transmission. Immediately, communities are in triage mode. You're not worried about global affairs or how far this flu's extending. If you have to suddenly care for that neighbor's farm and the 3 people in your house and this other guy who just stopped by, and then it's gone. And then the flu's gone. After it hits, it's gone, and there's no reason to keep lingering on it particularly. There's also a large number of concurrent events that are stealing attention. Like I mentioned, Bolshevik Revolution, World War I, armistice, demobilization, etc. People's minds aren't trying to figure out, epidemiology of the flu. And finally, Europeans were very provincial in the sense that many of them were literally rural. Half or over half the continent is living in rural locations, living on farms, small villages. And there's such a tremendous focus on the urban impact, both at the time and now, that aspect kind of gets overlooked. All right, so let's go into this rural Europe a little bit more. People never realized that it was a virus or bacillus. There were no doctors, nurses, no medicine. People just lay down and waited for death. Östersund was the nearest town. They did not know what it was. So flu historiography, the writing about the flu that we have, is largely defined by urban presses and government and medical elite sources in their interpretation. So this very elevated view and very urban view. Rural citizens, though, not a lot of access to news. And the news they did have was syndicated. So they're only reading about urban centers too. They're not reading about its breadth. They're reading about its specificity in certain locations. Obviously, even fewer had access to current medical news and studies. And even worse, most young, more educated doctors were at war. So older doctors with older ideas are interpreting and treating this flu for people. Now, we assume Europeans identified the pandemic as Spanish flu, but survivors did not necessarily recall the disease's origins as Spanish, nor its cause even as microbial. So of all the letters, all right, the ones that speculate on its origin, you can see here, Germany, 6 mentions, maybe it came from Germany. 6 mentions for Spain, maybe it came from Spain. And then a smattering of others. Well, most people didn't really even talk about where it came from. That wasn't important to their narrative. I think now with COVID-19, that would probably show up in people's first 2 or 3 sentences, right? It's from China. It was a global pandemic, right? That's a big part of that story. Also, looking here at cause, God or fate, when we think of the old times, 100 years ago, we think, oh, God, people probably blamed God or thought God had something to do with it. No, by this point, we're pretty secular in European history. Interestingly, though, miasma, and here maybe it's not so much a cause as a vector, that shows up a lot in the letters, and food shortages especially shows up. This disease was caused by food shortages, which opened up broke down the body's ability to respond and then become infected. And add to this all, right, flu is one of the most ephemeral of diseases. It's not really self-evident. It's these symptoms of clusters, and they're often vague. They're confused with other kinds of diseases. And even the definition in the preceding 100, 200 years before 1918 had changed the very definition of flu because they didn't know it was a virus. So they're just trying to figure out how it all hangs together. I still remember, we'll turn now to food insecurity and plague. I still remember how my father once organized a piece of butter, and we each had a fine piece of buttered bread. I could not understand at the time that my mother and brother and sister were too sick to be able to eat theirs. So butter here is a massive luxury in Germany, if it's even, especially if it's real butter, because there's fake butter or Satz butter at their time. But this kind of shows after 55 years, she remembers how important, this little piece of butter was to her family. So survivors of the flu correlated World War I, flu, and food insecurity. They see these things as existing together and interacting with each other. But a curious thing happened in the historiography as it's remembered later. World War I histories correlate war and food insecurity, and there's a lot of robust research on that. But World War I historians don't correlate food insecurity and flu because that's kind of out of their wheelhouse. Meanwhile, flu histories correlate World War I and the flu. They're often mentioned in the same context and written about the same context, but not food insecurity because we know flu is a virus, right? What does food insecurity have to do with flu? So why the disconnect? Well, societies experienced and embedded World War I in a collective narrative of death and deprivation. In other words, the war killed my fellow citizens on the home front and caused more to starve on the home front. It's a collective narrative of this experience. By contrast, societies experienced and embedded flu in individual narratives of death and deprivation. The flu killed many people in my community due to food insecurity. So you have this disconnect between the collective experience and the individual experience. And add to that, right, the cause of the war stayed the same. In 1918, the cause of the war was, Austria-Hungary, Germany, declare war, suddenly we're at war, right? That's the same now. But the cause of the flu has changed. Whereas in 1918, you would map the flu to malnutrition. In the popular culture and in our memory, we now know that it's a virus. So malnutrition, food insecurity has been forgotten as a result, even if it was important to the people at the time. Now let's look at how this connects to plague. So what did average Europeans think caused the 1918 flu pandemic? Well, They thought that World War I caused food shortages, and food shortages made them susceptible to a war plague. Now, that's a generic term, war plague. But it actually becomes quite literal for a lot of people upon seeing the way this flu affects their society. So 68 individuals remembered hearing the flu was or resembled plague, like actual literal pneumonic plague that has a 100% death rate. Like that's how dire and fateful people are feeling in 1918 at the end of this like massive war. And the symptoms are uncanny. Profuse projectile bleeding, like literal projectile bleeding, bloody noses, heliotrope cyanosis, black blood, destroyed lungs. I mean, these people look like wrecks. There's stories of people pulling rags of lung out of their throat and mouth. Like, this is gruesome stuff. And it hits so fast. I mean, people die in 24, 48 hours of this, combined with pneumonia. So in that sense, it seems reasonable, combined with sort of this, apocalyptic imagery of, all the death from the war and so forth. Like this feels, even though they're not talking about the Bible and God too much, it feels biblical. The other thing too is people don't know it's a virus. They're guessing it might be a bacteria. We don't really know yet. And so also at the end of the war, there's not a lot of medicine, not a lot of food. People are susceptible to a lot of other diseases then too. And so there's a lot of confusion about what it is based on it possibly being another disease or even side effects from the cures they were using. So lots of different ideas: cholera, sleeping sickness, smallpox, typhus, and so forth. There's some recommendations in my letters. Doctors were recommending people to just stay drunk for the entire course of their flu. So inebriation, like what does that cause? A lot of inhaling tar smoke and other chemicals to purify the air, sort of this miasmatic idea. So if you're locking yourself in a small room and inhaling a lot of tar, that probably has an ill health effect. Aspirin overdoses, also possible. So people might be dying trying to save themselves. Interestingly, in a different area of the world, China, there's so much endemic disease there that flu deaths barely even registered amidst other chronic diseases going on. So lots of confusion. Thus, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, going back to my thesis here, was a Spanish influenza pandemic for some contemporary elites, and most certainly for future historians. However, it was a local food insecurity plague as interpreted by contemporary Europeans. And I would add to that, in what I'm working on now, in the chapter I'm working on now, there's a strong feeling that this plague, whatever it was, had attached itself. They didn't know about virus, but they knew about bacteria, attached itself to fomites on the Western Front of the war. Because at that point, there's like possibly upwards of 1 million or more unburied human bodies, and then also the carcasses of donkeys and mules and horses and rats, etc. All of this pollution there, unexploded ordnance, destruction, that fomites with disease are sort of rising into the atmosphere and blowing around Europe or infecting their particular community somehow. And so there's also a sense that it's coming to them from the war, literally. I'm still working on this research right now, but that is where I'm going. So what are the implications of all this for us? Well, the 1918 flu threatened individual lives, but war and food insecurity threaten society's ways of life. So what I mean by that, or what this entails then, is that World War I and its food insecurity were remembered as collective experiences because it threatened an entire way of living, the economy, the culture, the society, the demographics, the relationship between the sexes, and all that. But the flu really only affected people's lives, right? It killed them and then they were dead. So, and then by contrast, when we look at a current pandemic, our most recent pandemic, COVID-19 threatened individual lives, definitely, but also collective ways of life by, lockdowns and masks and jobs and so forth. So is COVID-19 therefore more memorable as a historic event, mythologically more akin to World War I than the 1918 flu? Right? Maybe COVID-19 is more memorable or more similar to World War I in its threat to collective ways of life than it is to the 1918 flu, which killed 50 to 100 million people. And I'm not sure what the COVID global death count is now, but I doubt it's anywhere near that. Next, the 1918 flu was haphazardly identified as a local disease with myriad causal theories. So you have food insecurity, you have miasma, you have other diseases. To here and there, you see God mentioned, but it's local and it could have lots of causes. By contrast, COVID-19 was immediately identified as a global pandemic. That's the story from day one. And it only had two causal theories, right? It was an animal vector from a variety of different animals through, this wet market where people in China are buying food to eat or animals to eat or butcher, and or the Chinese government, right? The blame would lie at the government's feet instead of the consumers, as a leak at their high containment lab, which had been working on bat research. So there's two, and so you immediately have just a couple of reasons versus a sort of a miasma of reasons in 1918. Combine that with the belief that there's only one and potentially scarce cure, right? Like a vaccine. It's possible, that even though the 1918 flu was so much bigger, the COVID-19 was way more socially disruptive. When you have one single scarce vaccine, people start to get worried and nervous, and they start to blame the government, and they start to blame lots of people, and they start to get angry. When the government says we actually don't have, a role in curing you or helping you, you really can't blame the government for not doing it. So in 1918, people felt kind of empowered to come up with their own remedies. And there's, according to my database, there were dozens, if not hundreds. So, right, looking at how this affects society, COVID-19, even though it has a much smaller death count, probably way more destabilizing to society than the 1918 flu, more in line with the destabilization caused by the First World War. So that is the presentation. A final quote here from Jacques Barzun in his book, Science, the Glorious Entertainment. Progress is measured erroneously from then to now, instead of relatively to the present predicament. And what that means is we might say then till now, we have so much better drugs, we have so much better knowledge, we have so much better healthcare infrastructure and communications, like we're better, obviously. But maybe we should judge it relative to the present predicament, which is, do people trust healthcare? Do people trust the government? Are people getting the information they need? Is it accurate? Is it timely? To what degree does politics affect all that? And I think it's kind of apparent that we haven't really had much progress in creating that kind of society, even if the literal tools of science have gotten better. So that's the presentation, and thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Eicher. So if anybody has any questions, put it on the chat box or unmute yourself and ask. But before anybody does that, let me ask you one question. So during the COVID-19, there was a lot of, comparison made with the Spanish flu. And some of us in public health were also a little bit, I don't know whether to say disappointed, but to see that some of the tools in prevention that were taken, like the mask and isolation and quarantine, were pretty much the same even after so many years when the new pandemic came. Do you see, from a historical point of view, do you see why that is? Because that is not progress in terms of prevention for a pandemic.
Oh, so you're asking about to what degree these masks, isolation, quarantine were used in 1918?
Yes.
Yeah, because I'm working on this miasma chapter right now. I've gotten into the masks. If you Google, COVID, if you Google 1918 flu, and you look at the images, you're presented with like dozens of images of people wearing masks. That's because they came from 2 or 3 photo collections, all in the United States, one in San Francisco, I think Seattle, and then Walter Reed. Um, in Europe, vast majority of people are not using masks. I think there were maybe 5 people that mentioned them or so, maybe a few more in health related contexts. I have testimonies for, they're talking about it and they're saying, well, even if we told people to wear them, they wouldn't wear them right. And, 19 out of 20 people you tell to wear a mask, they're going to end up getting it anyway. And so I think there are a few reasons for that. For one, there was a feeling that if lots of people were wearing masks or it was public, it would look like more of a health crisis than they wanted to make it here at this very critical moment at the end of the war. It would be distracting. And also, by this point, there's so much fatalism uh, in Europe. And if you're thinking that it's a miasma, well, you're not just wearing a mask when you walk outside to go to the shop. You have to wear a mask when you're sleeping. You have to wear it when you're eating. You have to wear it in the middle of a field. Like if it's a miasma, how are you going to possibly escape it? And so there's sort of this acceptance that this is going to happen, and there's really not much we can do about it.
Okay, because yeah, that's a good point you made because I was not aware. Maybe some of those pictures came from the US and not necessarily from Europe.
Yeah, and
Um,
the US has like just a different mentality going into the war. They haven't been at war for 3 years. They're coming into the war with this optimistic, Americans can get it done. The old world is dying. We've got the answers. And that is a better environment for the kind of optimism you need for a huge social engineering project of trying to get people to wear masks, like this, like, we can do it because we have the answer. And in Europe, people are like, health officials have failed us, government officials have failed us, military officials have failed us, food people have failed. Everyone's failed us. So why would we listen to any new advice?
okay. All right, thank you. Anybody has any questions? Anybody in the room?
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead,
Uh,
Preeti.
First of all, a great presentation. This is very different from the past seminars I've attended.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I wanted to ask, these days with the recent globalization and a lot of digital tools that we are having, does it change the way we capture and analyze survivor experiences compared to earlier pandemics?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, we have so much more potential to capture just amazing narratives. And I think there were a few projects during COVID-19, that had people do digital diaries and journals. Um, Possibly the problem we have now is there's so much information in terms of like pandemic narratives and experiences that it becomes a problem of organizing it correctly or well enough that we can make it useful. And my research is kind of a half step in that direction. I started it before AI, But if I had the right tools and knowledge, I imagine I could make this database just eminently more easy to get information and specific, like good information out of with that. So yeah, I mean, the further we go back in time, the more scarce our sources become, and then the more difficult it is, the more inference and triangulation you have to have. So by no means is my letter database the end all of understanding the 1918 flu. I'm just taking educated stabs in the dark with it.
Thank you.
Anybody else? So while everybody's thinking, John, what about, I mean, we now know it was the H1N1, which is something that we see now too. Do you know when that was actually identified to be a H1N1 type virus?
Yeah. Yeah, the 1918 flu virus was identified as a virus in 1933. My knowledge of the trajectory of it as a viral, like scientific construct, past that really isn't that good. But I do know that then in 1999, I think Jeffrey is at Taubenberger, he uh, and a team visited a Inuit village in Alaska where they thought that there was still some bodies that were buried fast enough and they'd stayed in the permafrost cold enough. And they were actually able to extract then the DNA material from it and reconstruct it. So we do now have copies of the 1918 flu. In fact, one's here at the Penn State Huck Institute for research. So yeah, that's my knowledge of its viral then trajectory. In terms of names like H1 and if that name has changed, or I'm not quite sure.
Okay, thank you. Others? Usual, anybody in the room has questions? All right, it almost looks like everybody's quiet.
There's nothing from
So
here, so
okay. So John, thank you very much. I know you will be visiting UAB at least twice, right? Do you know the dates?
Once, but two presentations during that same, I think the October 14th and 15th, I believe. So I'm
Okay,
going to
so
be
one is
on
gonna
campus
be,
mostly on the 14th.
and one is going to be in the Department of History, and the other one is at the Lister Hill Library, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much. Hopefully some of us will see you during your visit. And everybody, you can have your extra 12 minutes. So we'll see you all next week. Okay, John, thank you again.
And thank you. Thanks all.